Good afternoon. My name's Paul Edwards. I direct the Wheatley Institute here at Brigham Young University. And on behalf of the Wheatley Institute and the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies, we're really grateful to have you here for today's discussion with Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. And we look forward to having you at future events. There's going to be some publicity about some things that are coming up, and I think there's a nice announcement that Quinn Meekum has here in a moment about next week. You should have seen at this point close by you a QR code, and that QR code is a way for you to ask questions that may come up during the session. So we'll have time for some Q&A, and we'll be curating some of those questions, and please make use of that as a way for us to gather those, and we'll share those a little later. I'd like to thank Sylvan Scott for that beautiful piano music as some prelude here. Sylvan is a Wheatley Student Scholar, and we're grateful for you setting the tone for us. Thanks so much, Sylvan. As is our tradition, we would like to begin with an invocation, and I will offer that. Our Father in heaven, how grateful we are to gather this day. We're grateful for the answered collective prayers we've had for the increased snowpack in the mountains and the refreshment of our lakes and reservoirs. We're grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this special community here at Brigham Young University, where we can come together and study about the important things that affect our world this day and how we can seek to improve them. We're especially grateful to have with us this day Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett, and for the great study and work that they have done to help us better understand the challenges that we face this day in our country and how we have addressed them in the past, that we might have a greater perspective on what we might do to help bring our country together. Father, we pray that as we now learn from them in this next hour, that thy Spirit will be with us to help us to have enlightenment and understanding and awareness of what we can do with this important knowledge to go forth to serve. We now invite thy Spirit to be here during our time together, and we pray that as we depart that we might enjoy blessings of safety and health throughout this day. And these favors and blessings we ask for now in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. I'd like to ask Quinn Meekum, the academic director of the Kennedy Center, to come forward and introduce today's guests. Quinn.
Thank you so much for being here. This is part of our winter semester lecture series on building a civil society. For those of you who do not know, every semester the Kennedy Center for International Studies selects a theme, and we bring in many prominent guests, both scholars and practitioners, on that topic to address us so that we can consider important issues in global as well as national affairs. We also select a book of the semester that is made available to faculty and staff and many students on campus as well to read in anticipation of that lecture series. And the book that we chose this semester is The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, by Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. And so we are so delighted that they are here with us. They're both very, very prominent scholars and thinkers and practitioners. I had the privilege at one point of being a student of Professor Putnam for a brief time. Robert Putnam is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. He's won about as many awards as a political scientist can win, right? And he's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the British Academy. He's the past president of the American Political Science Association. He's won the world's highest accolades for political scientists. Barack Obama awarded Bob the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities. He's written 15 books, translated into at least 20 languages, some of which are taught here on this campus. He has consulted for many presidents of the United States, as well as presidents and prime ministers in Asia and in Europe. Just recently, he was invited by Pope Francis to visit with the Pope at the Vatican and share some of the insights from his research and from this book. And as a little bit of a teaser, this year at South by Southwest, there is a film, a biopic film about Bob Putnam and his work on social capital and trust in the United States, which will be coming out this year, called Join or Die. Shaylyn Romney Garrett is also an award-winning writer. She's a change maker. She's interested in pursuing connection, community, and healing in a fragmented world. And she's co-author with Robert Putnam of The Upswing. Shaylyn provides thought leadership, both globally and nationally, on current challenges that we face. She's been part of Weave, the Social Fabric Project, an Aspen Institute initiative, and is a member of the Braver Angels Scholars Council and the Citizen University Civic Collaboratory. She's a social entrepreneur, and she will also be speaking at the Kennedy Center today at 5 p.m. on social entrepreneurship. She spent 6 years in Jordan building programs helping to catalyze youth social innovation in the Middle East. She holds a degree in government from Harvard University, is a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and perhaps most importantly, her parents are BYU graduates who went on their first date to the Wilkinson Center, the varsity theater where they watched The Sound of Music. And now she's here with us. So please join me in welcoming both Shaylyn Romney Garrett and Robert Putnam.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Thanks for including us in this very impressive lecture series this year, class series this year. It's great to be back. I think I first spoke on the BYU campus probably before some of you were even born. I spoke at what I guess is called Constitution Day, if I got the right place, in the Danny Ainge hall or building, which I remember very vividly because Danny Ainge, I come from Boston, and Boston has a basketball team. I'm not sure whether you've, and in fact this year Boston Celtics are favored to win, and everybody attributes that to what Danny Ainge did before he left and came back to be the general manager, I guess, of the Jazz. So that's my effort to kind of ingratiate myself with you, because I actually don't know Danny Ainge, but I watch him on television, and it's great for me to be here, and for Shaylyn and I both to have a chance to talk to you. What we would like to do, is share with you some of the empirical findings of this study called the Upswing. Why it's called the Upswing is really an important part of the story, and we'll explain that as we go. There are sort of two halves to this talk and book, one in which we try to describe what's happened recently, and one in which we try to figure out what lessons that has to fix the problems in America. And I want to begin there with the problems. We have the next slide. America is in what my mom would have called a real pickle. Is that a term? You understand what I mean? It's a technical, scientific term. America's in a pickle because in virtually every dimension of our society, by the way, if you want to, back there, if you want to stand, that's fine, but there's plenty of room up here, and I promise you no one will look at you when you leave. So if you want to come up here, do. No, okay. First of all, and some of this is not going to be surprising to you, some of it may be surprising, America is extremely polarized politically. And I'm going to show you some graphs and charts that illustrate data that are consistent with what I've said here. America is probably the most polarized politically than we have ever been in our entire national history, with the possible exception of the years between 1860 and 1865. You'll know what that means, and you'll know that means that it's a close call even, actually. By some measures, we're more polarized than we were on the eve of the Civil War. So we're really, really polarized. Separately from that, it turns out that we're also very unequal economically. The gap between rich and poor in America is probably higher than it's ever been in American history. That's a long American history. In that whole period, the gap between rich folks and poor folks has hardly ever been as big as it is today. And separately from that, the degree to which we connect with one another, what sometimes I've called social capital, but it just means connections with our friends and family and neighbors and community institutions, that also is at an all-time low. And lastly, our sense of being in a collectivity, of being a we, of we're all in this together, that is also at an all-time low. We're in a very, I would say, almost narcissistic period of our culture, focused on the self in many ways. And so now what I'm going to do now is the big question is, how do we get here? How do we get ourselves into this awful situation? And then the second question is, and Shaylyn is going to talk more about the second question, what do we do? What lessons can we learn from the history to help us? And we think there are very practical lessons that are applicable today, that you could walk out of here today and do to help turn this around. That's the bigger picture of the lecture. Okay, so far? So now I'm going to, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show you just a couple of slides. I'm a numbers person. If you're a numbers person, this is your time. If you're not a numbers person, that's okay too. Just close your eyes and settle back. And if I say something interesting, your neighbor will nudge you. And I know that many of you will have at least skimmed this book. Actually, this is not a test. I'm just trying to figure out audience familiarity. How many of you have opened the book called The Upswing? Okay, so roughly half of you have, and roughly half of you haven't. So I'm going to be trying mostly to speak to the people who haven't, so you get some sense of what's in the book. And there are a lot of graphs and charts in the book, and this is the first of them I want to show you. All the charts I'm going to show you are going to have the same format, so let's get adjusted to that right now. The horizontal axis is time. So this is 1880 and 1890 and 1900, sort of, here's where I'm born, and this is when I'm in college, and this is when my kids were born, and this is when my grandchildren were born, and this is when they were in college, and my grandchildren, I have 7 grandchildren, and they're mostly now in their 20s and off making a living, and here we are in 2023. That's the horizontal axis. So as we move from here to that end, we're looking at the history of the last 125 years, roughly speaking. And the vertical axis is a measure of how well we're doing by any of these 4 areas: politics, economics, society, and culture. And up is always going to be sort of good. So in the case of political polarization is down, and because that's not good. And comedy, which is just our term for the opposite of polarization, is up. And you can see, therefore, that around the turn of the century, the last century, around 1900, America was very polarized. At that point, we were more polarized. We were slightly less polarized than we had been between 1860 and 65, but we were awfully polarized there. But you can see, beginning in the early years of the 20th century, we began to move and become a little less polarized. Still, in the big picture, still awfully polarized, but the trend was going in that direction. Does that make sense? I'm not going to spend any time with you telling you how we measured any of these variables, because this is it's not that kind of a class, although, believe me, I'd love to tell you, because I spent years and years working on all these numbers. And behind each of the charts I'm going to give you, there are 20 other charts that use 5 or 6 other measures of, in this case, polarization. So just to illustrate, one measure of polarization is the degree to which people in the two parties in Washington vote either together or apart. If we're not very polarized, there are going to be lots of Republicans voting on one side and lots of Democrats voting on that same side and lots of Republicans and Democrats voting on the other side. In party terms, lots of overlap between the two parties. Does that make sense? But you know that number now, the number of people, Democrats who vote on with the Republicans or Republicans with Democrats, is essentially zero. That is, polarization could not mathematically be any more extreme than we are now. That's just one of lots of other measures. Lots of other measures include how do ordinary citizens feel about people in the other party and how about in local government, all that. Now you're going to just have to trust me, but I know this is a good audience and you will trust people, and so trust me. They all show the same pattern, and the pattern is high polarization. Remember, high polarization means low cooperation, low inter-party cooperation, getting better and better, rising through the 20s and 30s and 40s, and you know, you might think, well, people are cooperating because it's the wartime, but no, we keep going, and in the 50s we're still going up, and even into the 60s, we're becoming more cooperative, and that's an era of. Almost none of you will remember this. Well, probably none of you will actually remember the fact. Some of you will read the history. There was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower who was president in that period. And he was the least partisan president in American history, other than George Washington. He didn't cause this. His election was a reflection of this. This is making clear we were very, but then suddenly, silently, mysteriously, as the years went on, that trend reversed. You can see it reversed there in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Down, 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 down. The data in this book, because we had to stop collecting data and write the darn book, end in about 2015. 2015. But of course, we've kept track of what's happening ever since. And now we're down here. The data, if I could actually put the data on the chart, we're now, that's what I meant when I said we're more polarized, way more polarized than we were then, and even we're about at the level of 1860 to 65. Does that big picture make sense? You understand, we were once very polarized, then we got more and more cooperative politically, lots of bipartisan collaboration, and then now we're back down in a very polarized state. You certainly knew that we were very polarized, but you may not have known how we got there. Now I want to show, then I'm going to be quicker on the next slides because you have the basic idea. If we have the next slide, we're going to be looking at inequality. What's my target?
25.
25, okay, well, we're not doing so bad. The problem is I love data, and I could spend hours trying to persuade you that the data is really exciting, but I know I won't. I'm not going to do that because we got to get on to the substance. So here is the vertical axis, same horizontal axis. Vertical axis here is inequality or equality. Up is equality, down is inequality. This is what was called then the end of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, when there was a huge gap between the rich folks up on the Upper East Side of New York, all of whom had mansions and, you know, in today's terms, billions and billions of dollars, and just, 10 miles south of there on the Lower East Side of New York, there were a lot of the huddled masses who were impoverished. And that was the Gilded Age, big gap between rich and poor. And then, but here we are in the first years of the 20th century that we're already beginning to close the gap. In absolute terms, gap is still huge, but the trend is in the right direction. There's a pause here. That's the Roaring 20s, when the stock market took off and poor people didn't have jobs, and therefore there was a big raising. The trend reversed here. The trend of inequality reversed because of the Roaring 20s, but then now here, even before the Great Depression takes place, which is here, inequality goes up. Every year, you can see it there, every year, the rich people at the top are getting richer and richer, and the poor people at the bottom are getting poorer and poorer. And again, there are many different measures that we use for that. One is just the distribution of income. Another is the distribution of wealth, and before and after taxes, and how much chances there are mobility up for poor people to become rich, and so on. All of those graphs show exactly the same trend. getting more and more equal, rising up in the 40s, and then even into the 50s, and even into about 1960. And I want to give just a brief comparison. America in 1960 was almost the most equal country in the world. We were more equal than Sweden in the distribution of income. Think about that. It was astonishing how equal we were. And then things began to turn. 1960, and you can see gradually it goes down, 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 down. This is the middle of the Obama years, and it looked like maybe the downtrend had ended. But actually, again, if we continue the numbers to now, it just goes sharply down, and you know part of that is patterns of public policy under the previous president, under President Trump, where the rich got tax cuts and the poor didn't. And then part of it is, of course, the pandemic, which also caused inequality to grow. We all know that part. You all know this part of the story. What you might not have realized is that's just the tail end. I mean, the growth in inequality has been going on, you can see it there, for 50 years. I mean, Trump was barely in grade school when this began. So it's not basically a story about Trump. It's a story about something deeper. Does that make sense? That the advantage of getting these really long pictures is you can see some of the things that people would say about what causes polarization or inequality or whatever can't be true. It can't have any, it may be that Trump, for example, was riding a little bit on the waves of this, but he wasn't causing these. They're much deeper historical waves. Let's have the next slide, which is social cohesion. This is a measure of the degree. Again, it's a measure of lots of different measures that all tell the same story: the degree to which people are involved in their community, the degree to which they join groups, the degree to which the degree to which their family is a big deal. In some periods, many people don't get married and they don't have kids. And in other periods, most people do get married and do have kids. It's a measure, also in there are the measures of the degree to which people trust one another. So that's a measure of connectedness. It's what I, in some of my work, have called social capital. And again, you can see the same basic picture. Maybe Shaylyn later on will tell you what it looked like back here, but this is a period in which there was Americans were very disconnected with one another. In that period, many, many people remained for the whole of their lives as either spinsters or bachelors. Those were the language. I recognize that seems like old-fashioned language, but lots of people never got married, ever got married, and didn't have kids. But then gradually, and back there, most people didn't trust other people, but then gradually, you see again here, beginning of the 20th century, that begins to change. Still low social cohesion, but it's going in the right direction. Again, this pause in a little bit of a plateau there in the 20s, but then going up here. And here in 1960, not only was there a high degree of involvement, for example, in PTA. Do you know what the PTA is? Parent-teacher organizations. Every year, the PTAs across America got hundreds of thousands. Each year, the increment was hundreds of thousands of people. And it seemed like it was going on forever. Presumably, everybody in America would be a member of the PTA. But then, suddenly, that stopped. For all sorts of organizations, PTAs and bowling leagues. That's a reference to a great book you ought to read, actually. And then sort of sharply downwards. Steadily downwards, and keeps going down. And you know what that looks like now. You probably know. You know that lots and lots of young people in America never get married. They're not in this room, but there are lots and lots of young people who will never get married and won't have kids. And it's just like it was back 125 years ago. Do you see I'm trying to make you feel what this chart is telling you by reference to the parts of the chart that you've experienced. Most of the people in the room have never experienced anything of this chart except like from here on. But you know what this looks like, and I'm trying to show you what it used to look like. Last, I'll be quick about this. I'm almost supposed to be done by now, aren't I? Yes? Okay. I'll be very brief. The last is a set of measures about the degree to which we feel culturally as if we're one. Do we feel like we want to connect with other people, or are we narcissistic, focused only on me, 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 me? And if we have that slide, this is what that slide looks like. I wish I had time to talk you through it. Indeed, I wish I had time to explain the detailed measures here, because it's the one I'm most proud of as a political scientist. But there it is, the graph. So let's put all those charts together. You see, and you'd already guessed this, we've looked separately at politics, economics, society, and culture, and we've seen these four different slides, but they're not four different slides. They're the same picture. You see you should, as a statistical matter, your mind should be blown by now. How could it be that all of these features of American society were moving in rhythm? But they were. And so, since that's true, we can put them all in one single slide, and that's that. This slide summarizes to a remarkably accurate degree how America changed. Beginning over here, we were an I society, unequal, disconnected, fighting with each other politically, focused on the I. And over here, we were all very much connected, and we were equal, and we were politically cooperative, and we were culturally we thought of ourselves as a single country. But now, we're back like we were over there. In some respects, even worse by the time you get out to 2023, which is out here, even worse than we were there. More unequal, more polarized, more socially isolated, an epidemic of loneliness sweeping the country. I'm trying to echo the things you've heard about in public commentary now about the epidemic. The loneliness epidemic is a reference to this part of this whole graph. And we think of ourselves now as we're an I society. That's why we've come to call this the I curve. So that's the data, but Shaylyn, tell us what it means.
So Bob and I like to think of ourselves as a good team because he's the numbers guy and I'm the storyteller. So if you closed your eyes when he told you to a little bit before, because you weren't that into the data, I'm with you. But now's the part where you get to open your eyes. So let's talk a little bit about what this means. Bob's a humble guy, and he discovered this confluence of trends, which I just have to say, again, I'm not a numbers person, but even I can tell you how rare it is for this many measures, measuring this many disparate aspects of our society, to track the same trajectory over this long of a period of time. The correlation didn't just span a year, it didn't just span a decade, it spanned 125 years. And so what that means is that it passes something Bob likes to call the interocular trauma test. It hits you between the eyes that there's something going on here, right? So what is going on here? We're not the first commentators or scholars or writers to point out that America is in this multifaceted crisis. In fact, one of the early reviewers of our book said this is another addition to the How America Got Into This Mess genre of literature. Lots of people have spotted this downward trend, the fact that things have gotten worse and worse over the last half century. But rarer is those who have spotted the upward trend that preceded it. Because there's a couple of ways that you could look at this graph. You could look at this and say, you know what we need to do? We just need to turn back the clock and get to that part of our history when everything was better. We need to make America great again, right? And I want to be clear that that's actually not the message of this book. It's tempting to be nostalgic, to look back to a moment when supposedly everything was better. But there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, of course, is that period of American history and the we that we had built toward during that moment was a very flawed we. It was a we that did not include largely people of color, to a certain extent women, and many other groups, right? And so it was the moment when we came closest to realizing this aspect of the American project, but in a very flawed way. The other problem with looking at this graph sort of nostalgically is that it's not very helpful when you're in the middle of a crisis to look at another moment when it wasn't a crisis and say, oh, we really should do that. In fact, we feel that if there was a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's not the moment when we had everything figured out. It's the moment that most looks like the moment we're living through today. And that, I think, is one of the most breathtaking findings of this data, is that we have been in a mess just as difficult, just as multifaceted as the one that we're in today. We've been there once before. But we got out of it. We fixed it. We righted the ship and got things moving in the right direction again. So if ever there were a moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's not the moment at the top of the curve, it's the moment at the bottom of the curve when Americans figured out how to turn it around. Because one of the ways in which America was so similar back then during the Gilded Age to today is there were all these doomsday prophecies about the end of democracy. The American experiment had failed. Tyranny, oligarchy, plutocracy, all is lost. Does that sound familiar? We hear a lot of that in the media and in commentary today. But the thing that's so fascinating about the last Gilded Age is that none of those doomsday prophecies were fulfilled. On the contrary, and in quite an unexpected way, we entered this multifaceted, multi-decade upswing in which all of those negative trends started moving in the right direction again. And at some point, that reversed. But what we want to know is, what can we learn from the time when we got up and out of this and into an upswing? How can we recreate that upswing today? So I want to spend the remainder of our time together just looking at a few of the lessons from this period. So if we can go to the next slide. What we want to talk about was, what did this moment look like when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era? That is the moment on the heels of the Gilded Age that historians refer to as the Progressive Era, the moment when this shift began to happen. Now, I want to pause just briefly and make sure that we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say progressive. We hear that term a lot today, and generally today we're hearing it referred to as what I'd call small p progressivism. That is progressivism referring to the leftmost end of the political spectrum, right? When we talk about the progressive era, historically speaking, we are not talking about that type of small p progressivism. We're talking about what I'd call maybe capital P progressivism, which is not a political ideology. It's a movement that happened in American history. In fact, historians have called this movement so diverse as to be barely coherent. It was a movement that consisted of Republicans and Democrats and housewives and industrialists and immigrants and blacks and whites and all sorts of people who came together. They didn't agree on everything. A lot of times they were fighting about what they were trying to do together, but they were all united by this galvanizing belief that something had to change and that individual citizens had the power to change it. That's the progressivism and the progressive era that we're referring to, okay? So what was it about this progressive era that was so magical? Well, if we go back to the fact that this is primarily a statistical story, the backbone of this story is the data, and we have all these trends that are moving in the same direction at roughly the same time. When you have those kind of confluence of trends, one question you might ask is, well, which one of the trends turned upward first? If we can figure out what statisticians call the leading variable, then we might have some clue as to what we should focus on today if we want to create another upswing. If we focused on which thing, what might pull the rest of these trends upward? Does the data tell us anything about that? Well, we have a bit of a bias in America. You might have noticed that we tend to think that economics drives everything, which comes a little bit out of the social sciences. A lot of times social scientists treat individuals as economic actors, and the rest is just details, right? And so you might think, looking at these graphs, well, certainly it was the economic inequality that started to fix itself first, because that's usually the front end of the story. And what's so fascinating about this data is that it turns out to be really crystal clear that that's not true. In fact, the movement toward economic equality was a lagging variable. It was the last thing to change, which is really interesting, because a lot of times we hear debates today where we say, if we could just get the economic inequality fixed, then we would all feel like we're in this together and our problems would be solved. And that turns out not to have been how it worked last time. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying it's not important to focus on fixing economic inequality. That is an urgent and pressing issue in this country. But what we learn from this data is actually that maybe there's something underneath that we have to get right first. So if we know that economics was a lagging indicator, well, do we know what the leading indicator was? This is a little bit hard to say because we're dealing with, as Bob indicated, so many different data points. And from a sort of statistical perspective, we're looking really far back in time, 125 years ago. And so sometimes we like to compare it to being on the ground, looking up at a flock of birds in flight. And there's lots and lots of birds up there, and they're all moving in the same direction, and you're 1,000 feet down, and then all of a sudden you see them shift, and there's a turning point. They move in a different direction. And you think to yourself, which of those birds led the way? It's really hard to tell from that far away. And that's a little bit what we're dealing with here with this kind of a data, this sort of huge data sets that we're dealing with here. But what we can see when we pair the data we have with the historical record is that it begins to be really clear that the first thing that changed during the last upswing was a moral and cultural shift. Before we started changing our economics, before we started changing our politics, we started to question the cultural and moral underpinnings of our society. Now, what did America look like culturally during this Gilded Age? Not too long before the kind of 1880s, 1890s period, a guy named Charles Darwin came onto the scene and articulated the survival of the fittest. And this was a theory that spoke specifically to how the biological world works. But there were people who said, well, if that's how the natural world works, that's how society should work. We'll just structure it as one giant competition, and only the strong will survive and the devil take the hindmost. And that was called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin himself did not subscribe to this particular belief, but in his name, it became this cultural milieu that characterized the Gilded Age. It was a very I-focused, very self-centered way of seeing the world, right? And into that cultural moment came a movement called the social gospel. And this was a movement that came out of religious circles first. It was evangelical Protestant preachers who began to say, America doesn't just have economic problems or political problems, we have a moral problem. And at the heart of that moral problem is Christians not living their own moral values. Really interesting critiques of not only of the way that Christians were living their faith theologically. This was a time of very individualistic way of viewing religion. I'm concerned with my relationship to God, and I repent for my own sins, and everybody else, that's sort of their business. But these social gospelers came along and say, we don't need to just be concerned about individualistic morality, what I and my relationship to God looks like. We need to be concerned about creating a moral society, that our society is behaving in a moral way. And they began to put forth a vision of what that might look like. And again, this started amongst the religious, but it spread more broadly to the culture. And it began to inspire a generation of reformers to think differently about what our society could look like. And those reformers were the capital P progressives. So a couple of things that we know. If we want to see another upswing today, it's likely that it's not going to be a policy or an economic solution that comes first. We've got to get at something underneath, something deeper, what one of the social gospelers, Washington Gladden, called our primary conceptions. We have to address those first. So we're going to need to do that again today, most likely. But who were these progressives? Well, first of all, one thing we know that they were young. They were very young. Some of the most famous progressives, we tend to think of them like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago. You see these pictures of her when she was in her 80s. She was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And we forget that when she started doing her work, she was under the age of 30. In fact, almost all of the reformers that led the ideas and the organizations and the movements of the progressive era were under the age of 30 when they did their most important work. This was a youth-led movement, largely because it was a movement filled with young people who were living in a completely different world than the world their parents were brought up in. Does that sound familiar today? These people had lived through the Industrial Revolution. Their parents had lived on farms and lived in tiny towns in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden they were living in big industrialized cities and had to recreate a sense of how they were going to make democracy work in that setting. We are living through a very analogous period today, and we have to look to our post-boomer generations our youngest Americans, for the innovative solutions that transcend our ideological debates to find the solutions that are going to push us forward. It's you that are going to do this. You didn't create this problem, but you're going to have to solve it. Another thing we know about the progressives is that they prioritized something called association. That's kind of an antiquated term. That's the term they would have used for it. What today we might call it connections or relationship or community. They saw the importance of bringing people together, both as an end and as a means. As an end because they were lonely, right? These were young people who had moved off of farms and into these cities, and the sort of old social structures that used to bring people together, the quilting bees and the barn raisings, just weren't going to cut it in Chicago. And so you have people like Paul Harris, the founder of the Rotary Club, who had moved from a small town in New England to Chicago to become a lawyer, and he just didn't know anybody. So he invited 3 other professionals to come together and start having lunch together. And soon they started realizing that they had the power to do things together that would benefit their community and their city. And out of that grew the Rotary Club, one of the largest service organizations in the world, whose motto is service above self. A very pithy summary of this movement from I to we. So the progressives really prioritized bringing people together, particularly people across lines of difference, bringing people from that Upper East Side down to the Lower East Side so they could have conversations and meaningful relationships with immigrants who essentially were living in a different country up until that point, right? Okay, I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to cruise through the last of this. A lot of times when we look at the story of the progressive era, if any of you have studied that in your history classes, you'll probably think, oh, well, the progressive era, that was when we did all these big, huge national programs that changed the face of our nation. Child labor legislation and multiple constitutional amendments were passed, and we changed the way we did our elections in this country, and we did trust busting, and we created the Consumer Protection Agency, these huge federal programs, right? And oftentimes we think, well, that was the story of the progressives. They had a blueprint for how they were going to change everything from the top down, and they went about putting that into place. We believe that that's actually a false story about the progressive era. When you look at this movement, it actually began very much at the grassroots. People were working in what the progressive Louis Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy, beginning to solve problems right where they were, right on their own doorsteps. And what's so fascinating is if you look at the big national programs that ultimately changed the face of this nation, many of them were modeled after successful experiments that were happening at the local level, at the municipal level, and at the level of the state. And they went viral, and they bubbled up and became models for things that changed our nation. There's so many great examples of that. I wish we had more time to speak to those examples, but we'll move on. This wasn't a movement that was blueprinted and laid out by some charismatic leader. Again, when we think about the progressive era, we think, oh yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, he led that movement, right? Well, the true story of Teddy Roosevelt was more that he was kind of a political entrepreneur. He was a guy who saw a parade and got out in front of it and saw all of these great innovations and figured out a way to create reforms that could be palatable across party lines and push those reforms through. He was not on the front end of this movement. He was more on the back end, right? So today, we're going to be looking for a movement led by young people. A movement that's not afraid to articulate our problems in moral language. A movement that prioritizes bringing people together across lines of difference, that really focuses on trying out solutions at the local level, and that isn't looking for some national savior to come and bring us out of our misery. Now, the very last thing that I'll say about this is we've shared all these ways in which the progressives did all these great things, and we're lauding them for having changed the direction of the country and saved America in many ways, right? But not everything that they did was great, and not everything that they did was perfect. There were many cautionary tales that come out of this period as well. And I don't have time to go over all of them today, but we go into this in some detail in the book. But I will just say I want to highlight this. The progressives created a we in this country that was not inclusive. Their circle of moral concern simply did not extend to people of color, and to some extent to women as well. And they, not to put too fine a point on it, but many of these progressives were racist. And a lot of the structural racism that we are being asked to reckon with as a nation right now was actually built into these programs and these changes that fueled the upswing. But in a way that meant that the upswing had knit into it the seeds of its own demise. Because the needs of part of our society were sacrificed on the altar of progress. So if we want to see another upswing today, we cannot make that same mistake again. We cannot kick full inclusion down the road and racial reconciliation down the road and say, we'll deal with that later. We got to get the economics right this time. If we do that again, we're going to see this same up and down again. So those are some of the lessons from the upswing. We're super excited to hear what questions you have, but I just want to leave you with this parting thought, if we can just go to the last slide. This is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and we love this quote because we really feel like it really sums up the lesson of all of this data, which is this: the fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we believe it or not, whether we want to do it or not, when we come together, we go up together. We're all better off when we're all better off. And now we have the data to prove it. We've been in a mess just like the one we're in today. The history shows us that there's hope of getting out of it, but we have to start today. We have to start in places that might be less familiar to us, places of the heart, places of connection, to rebuild that social fabric and that sense of cohesion that's going to bring us back toward we. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaylyn and Bob. You've given us a lot to ponder and a lot to discuss. By way of process, we will go until 1 p.m. today. I recognize that some of you may have classes that begin at 1, and if you need to leave before our discussion starts, you're welcome to do that now. But we do have about 15 minutes, and thanks to this great technology that we brought in, we now have about 15 plus questions from the audience. We won't have time to address all of those questions, but I will try to group some of them together and pose them to our speakers. Again, we're very, very grateful that you made the trek down here today. Shaylyn, toward the end of your comments, you acknowledged that social cohesion and unity and comedy that was discussed maybe looked different in the first half of the 20th century. And we have a number of questions that are asking for a little bit more detail on that. For example, some have suggested that the first half of the 20th century was a unity that was just too narrow and too conformist to do justice to the real promise of America. Another question asks, how should we interpret the 60s, which seemed to be a high point in many ways in your graphs? I've always understood that to be a very divided time in the country, but you have it as a peak in your model. With a follow-up question, should we be looking, as we think about unity, for greater agreement on values, or just trying to be better at managing deep differences?
Well, we both want to talk about this.
Yeah,
I'll do the 60s or something.
Mm-hmm.
I have the advantage of actually, over almost everybody in the room, and actually remembering the 60s. I'm 82, and if you remember those slides, the turning point is sometime around 1962, 63, 64. I graduated from college in 63, and I voted for the first time in 1964. That's relevant because actually, you might wonder what caused this whole collapse of Western civilization. I did. When I graduated from college and voted, then everything else. But to be more serious, the 60s, the 60s, and actually, I'm not making this up, this is what all historians of the 60s say, the 60s was divided into two halves. The first half of the 60s was the 60s of communes and love and the summer of love and You can even see this, the first half of the 60s was when the Beatles were singing I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I Get By with a Little Help from My Friends. The first half of the 60s is the culmination of this, right? By that point, 50 or 60 years of becoming ever more connected. But then just like that, the second half of the 60s turns the corner, and the Beatles start, I won't go through this, but I have to say this. The last song the Beatles ever recorded together was in 1964, I think, and I'm going to sing the lyrics, the whole lyrics of this capstone of the Beatles' period of togetherness. Here are the lyrics. I, me, mine. I, me, mine. I, me, mine. I, me, mine. You have to remember the banjo or the that's it. They're in their music, they captured this turn from a society that was becoming ever more we and maybe a little too we, and everything else was overturned. So the second half of the 60s is the bad 60s, so to speak, and that's what, well, probably none of you even remember that, but the bad part of the 60s was really bad. I mean, it was the Manson murders, and it was, if we've actually done this test, we've asked different audiences, what do you remember, what is the 60s? And different audiences say different things. The older people who remember the 60s say it was the assassinations, because that's sort of what first happened. You know what I mean by, you may not even know what I mean by the assassination. That's Jack Kennedy getting assassinated, and then a few years later, Martin Luther King getting assassinated, and then Bobby Kennedy getting assassinated. And for some people, that's the 60s. For other people, it's about Vietnam, but not for everybody about Vietnam. For some people, it's about the pill, because the pill led to a dramatic revolution in sexual behavior. That was not linked really to the assassinations or to the Vietnam War. And then other people remember the gas lines and the raging inflation toward the 70s. There was a lot happening in the 60s. And we don't think, except for maybe me personally, we don't really think that there's any single cause, because it was a concatenation of all the things that we hadn't been taken care of, including race. And if you had to name the single thing that caused this reversal, it's the fact that we had not been taking care of race. And therefore, that was also the period of urban riots and it was also the period of the civil rights movement. Now, I'm going to turn to Shaylyn in a second to talk more about race, but I think one thing we want to say, I'll say this a little bit and then you can follow it up. Many people think, especially social scientists think, that history is determined. You find the laws of history and find that first economics changes, or maybe it's first something else changes, and then you go with the flow. We emphatically think that's wrong. I was trying to find a strong but polite term to say. We think that just is not true, that we're condemned by history. We think we can change, you can change things. Indeed, the only way that really serious change happens is because individual people decide they're going to change things. And that's what happened I'm going to get carried away here, because I mean this, and I'm talking to the younger people here. You did not cause this, just like your counterparts 125 years ago did not cause it. But the only way we're going to fix it is if you decide, together with some of your colleagues, to fix it. That's the way it worked last time. And so don't allow yourself to believe that there are laws of history which condemn you sometimes in the 60s to get better and sometimes in the 60s to get worse. That's not true. It was that people decided the kind of society they wanted to move toward. I'm not pointing just to you, but I am pointing at you. Go ahead.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to give a really brief answer about race. And I want to just say, we did write an entire chapter about this in the book. There's also a New York Times op-ed that we published summarizing the findings about race. So if you're interested in digging in on this, I recommend that you look those up. But I'll give you a quick summary, and I'll just build on what Bob said, which is that, that two halves of the 60s really manifested with the civil rights movement as well. in the early 60s, we finally built toward this we. We saw it in the data. We were culturally more oriented toward we than ever before. So it's sort of a no-brainer that that was the moment that we finally decided we could pass civil rights legislation. And the majority of Americans were behind that. And then when it came time to actually implementing that legislation, and the Johnson administration said, okay, here's what we're going to do to actually make things equal, Americans were like, white Americans, not in my backyard, right? And we see a huge white backlash to the civil rights movement happening when the Civil Rights Acts were beginning to be enforced, basically. And so it's hard to say whether that white backlash to the civil rights movement drove a broader cultural turn toward I, or whether we were already turning inward and turning toward I and circling the wagons racially was just a part of that phenomenon. We can't say. But those two phenomena were deeply intertwined, and they certainly reinforced one another, such that the more individualistic we became, the less we were willing to work toward true equality between the races. But I will also say this, that racism that was built in to the upswing, what happened with the white backlash was really just the exposure of the fact that we had never done the work of racial reconciliation underneath the surface. Yet another proof that you can legislate things into existence, but if people have not changed their hearts, nothing changes, right? That moral and cultural shift has got to lead. So we can pass all the laws we want saying we're going to be equal, but if we don't do that work in our hearts, in our lives, in our communities, to see one another as true equals, nothing's going to change. And that's the story of what happened. That's a brief summary of the story of what happened in terms of how this story relates to race.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. All right, 90 seconds each on this one, okay? Two related questions. It's possible that some people walking out of here today, having looked at Bob's graphs, will feel sad. When you find reasons for optimism, what are they? And then secondly, this is a very personal question from Robert Rex, and thanks Robert, maybe he's the one that you pointed at, Bob. He says, hey, I'm 26, what do I do starting today?
Yeah. Take the first one,
yeah.
second one.
So this is a somewhat religious setting, so I'm going to quote actually from one of the greatest religious leaders of the 21st century. Sadly, he died prematurely. His name was Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks was the chief rabbi of London. He was also one of the world's greatest moral philosophers, and to my great pleasure, he and I became personal friends. And actually, just 2-3 days ago, I took part in a very long memorial service for him that was actually held in Tel Aviv, but I was on Zoom, and Sacks is if you don't know the name S-A-C-K-S, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, it ought to be required reading in any moral course. He's deeply, deeply religious, but he's Orthodox, right? So but on the other hand, he's also deeply human. That's the most amazing thing about him. Okay. Jonathan Sacks distinguished between hope and optimism. And I'm now just repeating what he said. Optimism, he said, is a passive virtue. He's a religious guy, right? So he uses words like virtue. A passive virtue. If you're optimistic, you're standing back and you're looking and you're seeing trends going up or trends going down. But hope, he said, is an active virtue. Hope is saying, I can see how things could go in the right direction, and I'm going to do my darndest to make them go in that direction. Do you see the difference between whether you agree with Jonathan Sacks' theology or not? It's a very useful distinction. And it's useful to us because I think both of us, we don't know whether we're going to be optimistic or not. I mean, it's really hard to predict the future, as Yogi Berra said. It's especially hard to predict the future. But we're hopeful. Because now you should see what I mean by that. We can see how it could go in the right direction. And we want to, both of us, actually, I'm trying to change America. Not just to observe it, I hope you see that. And I'm not ashamed of that at all, even though I'm an academic social scientist and I count things and so on. I want to change America. Of course, who wouldn't want to change America? And that makes me hopeful, whether or not I'm optimistic. Does that make sense?
And I think the people in this audience, the students in this audience, are uniquely equipped to lead America into a more hopeful space. We love sharing this message at Christian colleges and universities because you already have the language. You already have the concepts that we need infused back into our society, back into our conversations about policy, right? What is the moral framework under which this nation, this society is operating? We need articulate, not just social entrepreneurs, not just political entrepreneurs, not just economic entrepreneurs. We need moral entrepreneurs who are willing to take that voice and infuse it into the public square in unique and innovative ways. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. That's a tough one, right? In a very secular moment in American history, for people who have a deep sense of virtue and a deep sense of right and wrong to come in and say, hey, we have something to add to this conversation and we're not going to be shy about it. That's what happened last time. I'm not just saying this because I'm trying to stroke your egos here, right? That's actually what the historical record says changed America the last time. So that's one thing that you can do, is find your voice. Figure out how what you know in your heart and in your own spiritual life, how can you translate that into the public sphere? And the other thing that I will just say is go and talk to your neighbor. I'm a little bit preaching to the choir here because on measures of social capital, Utah is off the charts, right? But people come to us all the time and say, how do we fix disinformation? How do we fix all these big problems, political polarization? And I say, do you know your neighbor's name? When was the last time that you asked them about something important, a way that you could get to know them? And people say, I don't know, right? The solution to these big problems is surprisingly granular. So you need to not get overwhelmed by how big the problems are and just start right where you are. One conversation across a line of difference tomorrow. Religious difference, political difference, demographic difference. Maybe you have a conversation with your grandmother, right, to get her perspective. Start there and grow from there, because that's the only way that we're going to reweave our social fabric.
Thank you. And if this discussion of active virtue appeals to you, please join us next Wednesday at noon in this building on the 3rd floor. Sharon Eubank will be speaking on the topic of putting the human in humanitarian efforts, and we hope to see you there. Please join me once again in offering a hearty thank you to our speakers today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.